So my name is Michael Staunton. I'm going to be speaking today on writing and reading chronicles in medieval England. I'll be talking a little bit about some of the references to the Mortimers in medieval chronicles and what this tells us about how people wrote chronicles and how people thought about history in the Central Middle Ages. Grateful for the invitation to speak to the Mortimer History Society. As Philip has said, my main interest is in historical writing in the Central Middle Ages, more so in the 12th century. But when my attention was focused on the Mortimers, thinking of coming here, I looked through my notes and I realized, as I'm sure you all know already, that the Mortimers are everywhere. So I'm going to start off by giving you a few examples of how the Mortimers appear in history and use that as a way to talk more generally about how and why people wrote chronicles in the Central Middle Ages in England and also how people read them. And I'm going to begin with, I suppose, a local boy in a way, a canon of Hereford Cathedral, Gerard de Alspaye, Gerard of Wales, probably the most famous historian writing in the late 12th century, in this part of the world at least. And Gerard, of course, was a remarkably prolific writer. He wrote not only history, but all kinds of other works. But at a certain early stage of his career, in 1189, in one of his earliest works, The Invasion of Ireland, he decided to write a list of the most remarkable events that had happened in recent years. And he, like a number of his contemporaries, was aware that he was living in very interesting times. And so he started off with the accession of Henry II in 1154, and he went on to talk about many other things, the murder of Thomas Becket, the invasion of Ireland, plans for crusade, and so on. But among the first things that he speaks about is about Hugh Mortimer. He refers to the siege of the noble castle of Bridgnorth and the forced surrender of that excellent knight, Hugh de Mortimer, which served as a frightful example to all. Need I say more? Favour everywhere favoured Henry II, to the confusion of the strong and the making smooth of that which was rough, and those who withheld the kingdom from him, as well as all those who disturbed the peace. His brothers to begin with, then later his sons too were overthrown. Now you can see from this that this is not simply a statement of fact. These things happened, but it's also a retrospective assessment of events. Referring to Hugh de Mortimer as an excellent knight, he's, as we'll see, a little bit more favourable towards him than many other people writing at this time. He talks about how it was an example to all, as if we can learn from this event. He talks about fortune. Gerald is very influenced by classical writing, and he talks about fortuna. And he's also talking with a certain perspective. He's saying that this is the first time that Henry II was challenged, and he proved that he could face down these challenges. Not just from Hugh de Mortimer, but from other people as well, including his sons. This marks an early entry of the Mortimers onto the political stage. And this event is something that is touched on by a number of other writers. A peculiar feature of historical writing in the 12th century is that the early years of Henry II are particularly bad years for historical writing in England. Hardly anybody is writing about those events. in my opinion at least, the golden age of English historical writing is the second quarter of the 12th century. That's a time when you have people like William of Malmesbury, Henry of Huntingdon, and Geoffrey of Monmouth too, who was the most widely read of any of these historians. And they really reshaped people's views of the Anglo-Saxon past, linked it to the Anglo-Norman present. By 1154, all of these voices had gone quiet. And so you've got no English writer writing a broad contemporary history of the 1150s or the 1160s into the 1170s. So one of the earliest accounts we have of this event is from a Norman writer, Robert of Torigny. And here you can see a somewhat similar account, saying that he refers to Hugh de Mortimer as a most arrogant and overconfident man who fortified his castles against the king, all of which King Henry immediately besieged, and after a while he took the last Cleobury and destroyed it. This is the kind of event that appears in later histories. It's a significant event of Henry II's early reign. You can see this in Ralph of Coggeshall. This is his entire chronicle for that year. Ralph of Coggeshall, writing in, probably wrote this around the 1190s. And that's all he says for 1155. The main event then was Henry II overcoming Hugh de Mortimer, and Henry II was born. Not everybody decided to address 1155. I haven't put it up here, but the Wigmore Chronicle, I haven't put it in your handout. The Wigmore Chronicle, at least the Latin Chronicle, didn't seem to remember anything that had happened in 1155. The Wigmore Chronicle, of course, being associated with the Mortimer family. But to be fair, the French Chronicle, the Anglo-Norman Chronicle of Wigmore did actually refer to this event. When historical writing revives in England, it's in the late 1170s, the 1180s, and particularly in the 1190s. And the revival was really driven by, mainly, an interest in the remarkable events that Gerald of Wales talked about. So, in the last quarter of the 12th century, you have a really remarkable group of historians writing. The variety of backgrounds, the variety of types of history is extraordinary. You've got not only monastic writers, or such as Ralph of Coggeshall, you've also got certain people who are close to royal government, who have been described as administrative or civil service historians. They're people who work in Henry II and later Richard's administration. They are able to lay their hands on documents, and they can write very, very detailed accounts of recent history. This is another striking feature of history in England at the end of the 12th century. Most people are writing about recent events. I think that part of a stimulus for this was the murder of Thomas Becket. The fact that you have, within 10 years of Thomas Becket's murder, you have at least 10 accounts of of his life written. And this stimulates other people to write about their own times. But those who wrote, say, in the 1190s, when they look back on Hugh Mortimer and his standing up to Henry II, they weren't simply interested in, was Hugh Mortimer an arrogant individual, or what exactly happened. They were looking at it with a certain perspective. And that perspective was one in which they could see that Henry II had had this remarkable success in his early years that had later on come to a tragic end. That after the great success of coming to the throne as a young man, defeating all of his rivals, fortune smiling on him, or as others would put it, God smiling on him, he threw it all away. With his role in the murder of Thomas Becket, he was punished by the rebellion of his children, and he never succeeded in doing sufficient penance. And in the end, he died a defeated king. So you have people like Gervase of Canterbury, a monk of Canterbury, William of Newburgh, neither of whom are particularly sympathetic to Henry II. Gervase of Canterbury was somebody who was made a monk by Thomas Becket. But he writes of this event, you can see the top account, in a way that uses Hugh Mortimer as a figure in this broader story of Henry II. In his account, you have Hugh Mortimer eager to rebel against the new king, strengthening and holding 3 castles against the king. But Henry II, flying there very quickly, immediately besieged these castles, soon after captured them and forced Hugh to surrender. Thus, in brief, by God's assistance, peace was born and confirmed throughout England, and all sons of peace rejoiced, and all warlike men were disturbed. Gervase is building up Henry II so that he can later have him crash down. Similarly with William of Newburgh. William of Newburgh chooses a number of events. He chooses this event, Hugh Mortimer standing up against Henry II and being defeated. The King of Scotland standing up against Henry II and being faced down by this young king. And all of these are being used to make a more general point about Henry II. The final example of an account of Hugh Mortimer's resistance is from the Chronicle of Battle Abbey. And the Chronicle of Battle Abbey, it's about the history and the more recent struggles of Battle Abbey, founded by William the Conqueror on the place where he defeated Harold. And it's mainly about very local matters, principally about the struggle between the abbot of Battle Abbey and the Bishop of Chichester. Battle Abbey claims certain liberties, claims that it shouldn't be under the control of the Bishop of Chichester, says it has a charter from William the Conqueror, and the abbot spends a lot of his time trying to have that charter recognised. So Hugh Mortimer appears in this context. The chronicler has gone on at some length about how at a meeting, a discussion of this, the Bishop of Chichester had the upper hand. Nobody was taking any notice of the monk's charter. What happened? Though everybody else in the abbey was afraid of what would happen, thought their cause was lost, the abbot had trust in God, for it's written, "Man proposes, God disposes." And Christ did not suffer his church to be bereft of its ancient and just privileges, but at an appropriate time, by his watchful mercy, he renewed them stronger than before. So who is the agent of God's will? It is Hugh Mortimer. Hugh Mortimer stands up to Henry II, and Henry II is forced to race down to that part of the country and to besiege these castles. Taking this as his cue, the abbot runs after King Henry, manages to get a bit of time with him, convinces him of how important these charters are, and he gets his way. So this is an example, probably the best example of these ones that I've shown you, of how when somebody like Hugh Mortimer at this point, who has not really become a major figure on the national stage. When he appears in the Chronicles, it's often as part of something else. It's part of a broader picture, whether that is writing about Henry II or whether it's writing about Battle Abbey. The great age of historical writing, you could say, comes to an end in around the year 1200. A later writer, Nicholas Trevitt, writing in the early 14th century, said, about the year 1200, people seemed to stop writing history, or at least their histories weren't as good. Maybe it was because they weren't as proud of their kings as earlier people were. For whatever reason, this great variety that you have in historical writing, and especially writing about recent events, comes to an end about the year 1200. That's not to say that you don't have histories in the 13th century. Historical writing in England remains very, very rich. The best known name is Matthew Paris, who wrote massive works on the history of England and also linked the history of England to the history of Europe, went back into earlier times and brought it up to his present day. And you do also have particular episodes that gain the attention of historians. One of those is the Barons' War. Simon de Montfort and the barons and their rebellion against King Henry III. Most of the historical writing at this time is in monasteries, or in some cases Augustinian houses. And here you have the Mortimers again appearing in an important role. Roger Mortimer playing an important role in the defeat of Simon de Montfort. The Mortimers, after an initial flirtation with the baronial side, became very trenchant supporters of the crown. And they were there at the crucial moment in the Battle of Evesham in 1265. A recently unearthed account in French suggests that it was actually Roger Mortimer who struck the fatal blow that felled Simon de Montfort. And the manuscript, unfortunately, is corrupt just at this moment. But it does say that his lance struck him through the neck, and it was Sir Roger de Mortimer, for he could be recognized by his armor and shield straps. Now, as well as that, you also have an important, different role being played by his wife Maud. And this is from a chronicle in Middle English verse attributed to Robert of Gloucester. And it talks about the battle fierce on both sides. Alas, but at the end the weaker were conquered. Sir Simon was slain and his men struck to the earth. Greater murder was there never before in so short a time. But among all the rest, the most pitiful thing was this, that Sir Simon the old man they dismembered so. And so it goes on about the gruesome dismemberment. And to his head they smote off, and to Wigmore it sent, to Dame Maud de Mortimer, who right sorely abused it. Now this is written, as most of these accounts of the Battle of Evesham are written, from a pro-baronial position. So this is by no means praising Maud for having this souvenir of the battle. Here's another account of the same event from a London chronicle. This is even more gruesome. I won't go through all of the details, but as you can see, again, the wife of Sir Roger de Mortimer plays a role in it. But there's something else that I draw your attention to, is where it talks about on the same day and at the same hour that the battle took place, there was a very great tempest in London and elsewhere, accompanied with coruscations, lightning, and thunder. This is something that is said in a number of accounts of this event. They present it as being accompanied by these natural phenomena. The language is from the Bible. They will talk about either using this language, which is from the Psalms, or talking about a darkness covering the face of the earth, as after the Passion of Christ. Simon de Montfort's death is presented as a tragedy. He is presented as a martyr. He's associated as well with Thomas Becket. When Thomas Becket dies, a darkness covers the earth as well. So the Mortimer role from this hostile position is, I suppose, as one of his persecutors. And with this in mind, take a look at this other account of what happens and how Maud is represented. It says, the Earl of Leicester, their captain, his head cut off, his feet and hands amputated, whose head was presented to the wife of Roger de Mortimer in the castle of Wigmore. May the precursor of the Lord aid his soul, whose head was offered to a dancing girl at a feast. Now this is a reference to Salome being given the head of John the Baptist. It's quite an inventive way of discussing this. St. Albans was a great centre of historical writing in this period. It's where Matthew Paris wrote his chronicles. And anyone who was able to read this chronicle or to understand it in Latin was going to get this reference. Again, on the same lines, you have, here's the Annals of Worcester. And look at how the Annals of Worcester presents this battle, when it happened. It says that it occurred on the feast of the discovery of St. Stephen the Martyr, St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Unlike the Battle of the Maccabees again seen in the Middle Ages as martyrs and associated with Christian martyrs, when the sunlight reflected off the bronze and gold shields shone on the mountains. From morning up until almost the hour of sext, there was a darkness upon the land, thunder and lightning light up the world, and especially through the kingdom of England. Now, as I said, most of these accounts are sympathetic to Simon de Montfort and hostile to the royalist side. Well, we have some exceptions. One of those is Thomas Wicks, an Augustinian canon of Osney, who we know nothing about. And there's actually another Osney chronicle, which is pro-Montfort. And Thomas Wicks follows this chronicle for most of his chronicle, but then takes a different slant on the Barons' War. So see what he says about it, and the date. The other writer referred to it as the feast of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Thomas Wicks says, it occurred on the day of Mars, that's Tuesday, after the feast of St. Peter in Chains, the 4th day of August, namely the day before the nones of August. The king, therefore, with trumpets sounding in triumph, was led into the town, liberated from the ignominy of long-lasting captivity by the probity of the Son, whom he loved most tenderly. His people in tears of joy, he was restored to his former freedom. I've seen this account referred to as Thomas Wicks is very, very specific. He's quite pedantic about the date, but it's more than that. He's associating it with the Feast of St. Peter of Chains, symbolizing escape from captivity. Here, King Henry is represented as escaping from captivity. And some of you may have an idea where I'm going next with this. For another escape that occurred on the Feast of St. Peter in Chains. And I'm going to fast forward to the year 1323, when Roger Mortimer, another Roger Mortimer, I suppose the most famous Roger Mortimer, escaped from the Tower of London. Again, very many accounts of this event. The escape of Roger Mortimer, along with his uncle, also Roger Mortimer, and some others, was a very important event in the overthrow of Edward II and Mortimer's own establishment in rule. So we have a lot of accounts of this. In one of the later accounts from Henry Knighton, it gives a very straightforward kind of account of what happened. It says in the year 1323, Roger Mortimer escaped from the Tower of London, mentions the people who were involved in it. It talks about one of the people, one of the lower ranked jailers who connived with him and escaped, and says that they fled into France and after some time met up with some of the others. We also naturally have a number of accounts of this from London chroniclers who were on the scene. And this is cut off a little here, but I'll read it out to you. It says, this is from the French Chronicle of London. On Monday, the feast of St. Peter, 1st of August, at night, Roger Mortimer, Lord of Wigmore, by means of a potion subtly made and given to the constable in the watch of the tower and others, escaped from the Tower of London using a rope ladder and fled to Portchester. Others say he went to Portsmouth. And then he crossed the sea and so on. Another London account gives a slightly different version, where it says, on the night following the feast of St. Peter of Chains, Roger Mortimer escaped from the Tower of London, crossed the Thames up to the mill house of John de Gisors. Talks about how 7 horses had been prepared, and Roger, along with 7 others, set off on them towards the sea. I'm not quite sure how 7 with 7 horses and Roger, how that worked. They found a boat and off they went. Now, I'm going to give you, and there's a big chunk of text here. These are the last 2 examples I'm going to give you. And these are much more reflective accounts. And they focus much more on this idea of St. Peter's captivity. This one, Henry of Blainford, another monk of St. Albans, he gets the year wrong, 1324. He's a year late, but he says it was on the feast of St. Peter in Chains. He says, Roger Mortimer was less civilly than fitting being detained in the Tower of London, along with his uncle. He talks about their escape. And then he says, out of the deepest inspiration of the heart, he devised a secret liberation, unheard of ever or incomprehensible. For in the silence of the dark night, they'd given a poison to the jailers, everybody was asleep, and he entered the kitchen, not through the door of his chamber, which was bolted with many bars, but elsewhere, through a break in the wall. He exited through the roof, and he reached one ward of the castle. Then, using ropes ingeniously made into a ladder, he escaped. And like St. Peter, detained in Nero's chains, it wasn't actually Nero, it was Herod, but anyway, that could have been a copyist mistake, actually. Detained in Nero's chains and led by an angel, he passed the 1st and 2nd ward and finally came to the Thames. An even more detailed and, I suppose, literary account is from Robert of Reading, one of the many writers of the Flores Historiarum, a chronicle that was begun in St. Albans and continued in Westminster. This is quite a strange and interesting work, very, very hostile to the king. Talks at great length about the tyranny of Edward II. So in this scheme of things, Roger Mortimer is a heroic figure. This chronicle may have been written as a justification for the rule of Mortimer and Isabella. And it certainly seems to have been written before his death. So in this account, he says, the cruel king sent detestable ministers to the Tower of London, where Roger and Roger Mortimer were held with shackles and subjected the people to a further torture. And when the king was about to bring him out, behold, on the night of St. Peter in chains, the Spirit of the Lord and his grace were present in the prison. And he touched his heart and raised him up, saying, arise quickly and follow me. So he went out and followed him. And it's true that it was done through Christ, so he did not think he was seeing a vision. Slightly strange language to use if you're trying to describe a dramatic escape. Some of you may recognize that this comes from the account in Acts of St. Peter's escape from prison. When they were past the first and the second ward, they reached the other side of the Thames, and eventually he escapes. And when Roger had come to himself, he said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the English people. Many of you will have a better sense of Roger Mortimer than I have, but this isn't the kind of language that you can really imagine him using. Again, it's from the account of the escape of St. Peter. So what does all of this tell us about writing and reading history in the Central Middle Ages? Well, I'd say a few things. The first is that inevitably our perspective is distorted. We're interested in medieval chronicles primarily for what they tell us of a subject of interest to us, and that could be the Mortimers. It could be the political history of England. It could be the history of the marches. It could be the history of the nobility. And it's true that people in the Middle Ages also read chronicles selectively. Not everybody started at the beginning, which was often creation, and read through. One of the historians of the late 12th century, Ralph of Dis, said at the start of his chronicle, he said, you're not going to want to read all of this. So instead, I've put in a few symbols. So if you want to read about, say, the Counts of Anjou, look for this symbol and skim through it. And that's the way people have always read these things. And I think it's the way that we increasingly do it, especially when you have, say, a big scholarly tome. Most people skim through it and they look for what they're interested in. But what this means is that our interests are not necessarily the interests of those who wrote and who read chronicles in the 12th or the 13th or the 14th centuries. So, for example, we can see, especially with Hugh de Mortimer, Hugh Mortimer is a very minor figure. They're interested in him in a way as a sort of a hook to hang on a larger story about Henry II or about those times. Another thing is that there's a huge range of historical writing in this period. One of the writers who I mentioned, Gervase of Canterbury, he made a distinction between chronicles and history. He said that chronicle writers are just there to say, this is the date that this happened, this is what the king did, these are the eclipses or any other signs in the sky that happened in this year. He says that historians are more pretentious. Historians elaborate. Historians like the sound of their own voice. They like their literary extravagances. And Gervase himself says, I'm not a historian, I'm a mere chronicler. And then he goes on at great length to expound on this. But you have those very precise chroniclers who are mainly there to note down the important events of the time. It's an aid to memory. You've got others who have a wider purpose, and they are more literary works, and we need to understand them in a certain way as literary works. It's my view that the main reason why chronicles were written, and still the great value of them now, is simply to know about what happened in the past. But in order to understand that, we need to understand them from a certain literary approach, to see what they are really saying. Another important fact is that very few people actually wrote these histories. You have a few of these that had a wide readership. For example, Gerald's works on Ireland, very widely read. Most of these survive, most of the ones that I've mentioned survive in one manuscript. So the Chronicle of Battle Abbey, the Worcester Annals, Thomas Wicks, the Annales Paulini, Henry of Blaneford, all in one manuscript. And this changes how we need to consider how they are written and read. Now, all of us obviously hope for a wide audience, but most of us, if we're dealing with something that is, say academics in particular, you're expecting that you're going to have a relatively limited audience, and you write in response to that. Similarly, with many of these works, they were written with the understanding that their readership would be relatively limited. And I think that sometimes when people talk about historical writing now, and people who study it, they're often focused on, say, the propaganda value of historical writing. What's the message that these writers are trying to get out there? How are they trying to manipulate people's interpretation of things? My view on this is that actually these chronicles didn't have, in most cases, a very strong propaganda value. Most people were actually preaching to the converted. We talk about nowadays how, with the way people get their news, and especially from the internet, that people are talking in a bubble to people with the same views as themselves. Something similar was going on with many of these people writing. If somebody was writing about the Barons' War in a way critical of the Barons, they were expecting that the people reading this would also be critical of it. Chronicles are in a way the tip of the iceberg. We're seeing reflected here ideas that were already being spoken about. I think we can assume, and sometimes we can see that. Another thing is that you can talk about a kind of a shared language. And I don't just mean that they're churchmen, they're writing in Latin, but also that they had a store of references that came from the Bible, that came from the church fathers, that increasingly came from classical writing as well, and that people would have understood. It was a natural way to talk about an escape from prison by referring to the escape of St. Peter. When King Richard the Lionheart left German prison, and he didn't escape from it, they paid a huge ransom, he is he's given the same words as St. Peter and later Roger Mortimer, in saying, God has taken me out of captivity. So this is the kind of way people spoke about things. So to conclude, what I think this means for us in looking at how people wrote and how people read histories in the Middle Ages is to say that medieval historians could be very selective, they could be obscure, they could be interested in different things to us, they could be partisan, they could mix fact and fiction. But they're still very valuable accounts not only of the events themselves, but how people at the time felt about the events themselves. The people who wrote and who read histories in the Central Middle Ages were driven by curiosity. They were curious about what happened in the past, and they were curious about what we should make of what happened in the past. And in that way, they're a lot more like us than maybe we realize. Thank you.